A lone starship, the Sentinel, sent a distress signal, one last cry for help. The message was simple, but chilling. It came from a far-off, isolated planet on the edge of known space, a place that had been silent for years. The crew of the Sentinel had been investigating the sudden disappearance of entire colonies in the sector, and they had found something unimaginable. The captain, Marcus Kane, issued a final plea for rescue. His message echoed through the galaxy. Help. We're not alone. They are coming. Please. The transmission cut off abruptly, sending a ripple of fear through the galaxy's military and command stations. There was no answer, no immediate response. It was as though the universe was holding its breath, waiting for something darker to unfold. But no one could have prepared for what came next. Just as the distress signal faded into silence, another transmission arrived. This time, not from the Sentinel, but from an unknown source. The message was faint, distorted, but the fear in the voice was unmistakable. We've made contact. They're here. It's worse than we thought. God help us. Before the message cut off entirely, a strange symbol appeared on the screen. A dark, spiraling shape that seemed to pulse like a living thing. The galaxy's last hope was now fading. Part 2. The first encounter. Introduce tension and make the audience feel something sinister is unfolding. The galaxy was on edge, but no one knew what was truly coming. A fleet was mobilized, led by General Elena Voss, a seasoned leader known for her fierce determination. She and her team were tasked with investigating the Sentinel's disappearance and the mysterious distress signal that followed. As they reached the coordinates, something was wrong. The planet was there, but it wasn't like anything they had expected. It was as if reality itself was being twisted. The atmosphere was thick, charged with an unnatural energy, and the skies were filled with storm clouds that didn't belong to any weather system they had seen before. They were being watched. Suddenly, the crew of the fleet discovered the horrifying truth. The Sentinel was abandoned, its crew wiped out. The ship itself was covered in strange markings, as if something had scrawled its presence onto the very surface of the vessel. What was worse, however, was the discovery of a strange alien object at the center of the ship's control room. The artifact was dark, pulsating, and emanated a low hum. General Voss's team was on edge as the artifact reacted violently to their touch, sending out a pulse of energy that set off alarms across the fleet. Then the first attack came. From the skies above the planet, an army of shadowy figures descended. The creatures were unlike anything the galaxy had seen. You said, Part 1. The desperate signal, 5 to 7 minute hook. 800 words ka leko or interesting humachaya or third-person style, ma lekniha or simple basic English ka use karnaha write in paragraph without heading to story or long part honachaya. ChatGPT said. The galaxy had been quiet for years, but then came a signal, a distress call that shattered the peace. The message came from an outpost far on the edge of known space, a region no one dared to venture for years. No one knew what happened to the colonies that had been stationed there, but rumors whispered of things disappearing. People, entire settlements, lost without a trace. The signal was faint at first, barely enough to be heard through the static. But as the crew of the Starfire, a military vessel assigned to investigate, began to decrypt the message, a cold shiver ran through the entire crew. Captain Aiden Hawk stood at the center of the operations room, his eyes scanning the flickering screen. The words that appeared were short, but chilling. Help. We're not alone. They're coming. Please, hurry. Then the transmission ended abruptly. Hawk's pulse quickened. He glanced at his officers, all of them looking at each other with a mix of confusion and concern. It was strange. No one had heard from the outpost in years. And now this. Something wasn't right. What were they really dealing with? The ship's crew had been trained for almost every kind of disaster, from hostile alien invasions to solar storms, but the sudden disappearance of an entire colony was something different. The mysterious signal had no clear source, no point of origin. No one had been able to track it. They had no choice but to respond. They had to investigate. The Starfire immediately changed course and headed toward the coordinates. As they neared the planet, a strange, thick cloud covered the surface, like something was blocking the way. It was not a natural phenomenon. The sensors were useless, failing to pierce through the fog that surrounded the planet. The air was thick with static, causing the crew to exchange nervous glances. The captain looked out at the swirling clouds, trying to focus on anything that could provide some answers. But there was nothing. The only thing he could hear now was the sound of the ship's engines and the occasional creak of metal. The unknown was closing in, and it was suffocating. "Captain, we're being pulled in. We have no control," the helmsman reported, his voice trembling with fear. Before Hawk could respond, something more unexpected happened. A second transmission blared over the ship's communication system, even louder than the first. The crew immediately froze in place. It was an eerie sound, like the desperate cries of someone trying to warn them. The voice was distorted, the words barely comprehensible. But one thing was clear. They came. "It's worse than we thought. It's not just them. They." Then, a loud crashing noise interrupted the transmission. The crew's faces turned pale. The voice had stopped mid-sentence, but the strange symbol that appeared on the screen, pulsing like a dark, swirling vortex, sent a chill through every one of them. "Captain," Lieutenant Sasha Reed, the comms officer, whispered, "What is that? What's happening?" The symbol flickered once more, then vanished, replaced by nothing but static. The transmission cut off, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. "Set a course for the surface. Full speed," Hawk ordered, his voice a mixture of command and uncertainty. He didn't know what they were about to face, but every instinct told him that they weren't walking into a normal rescue mission. Whatever it was much worse. As they descended toward the planet's surface, the fog thickened. The visibility was almost non-existent. The ship's hull shook violently as they pierced the storm above the surface, the powerful winds outside rattling the vessel. The air around them felt heavy, oppressive. It felt wrong. And the feeling grew stronger the closer they got to the coordinates where the distress signal had originated. Through the haze, the dark silhouette of a structure appeared. An old, abandoned colony station, its once shining walls now tarnished and crumbling, stood like a monument to something forgotten. There was no sign of life, no movement. It was as though the entire settlement had been deserted, leaving behind only the echo of its existence. Yet the air seemed to hum with an energy they couldn't place. It was as if the planet itself was alive, watching them. "Prepare for landing," Hawk ordered as the crew geared up for what was sure to be a dangerous mission. The Starfire slowly descended, the ground below covered in an unnatural mist. As the ship's engines powered down, the crew prepared to step onto the surface of the forgotten colony. They suited up in their protective gear, ready for whatever awaited them. Captain Hawk led the way, stepping off the ship and into the eerie silence. The rest of the team followed closely behind, their footsteps muted on the planet's cold, barren ground. They approached the colony's entrance cautiously, scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. But there was nothing. No bodies. No obvious signs of violence. It was as if the people here had simply vanished. The only sign of life was the unsettling hum of the energy field surrounding the building. Hawk's stomach twisted in knots as they moved deeper into the structure. Then, out of nowhere, a low, distant rumble vibrated through the ground beneath them, shaking the walls of the colony. Something was coming. The silence had been broken. Whatever had caused the disappearance of the outpost and the distress signal wasn't just a threat. It was something far worse. In that moment, Captain Hawk knew they had just opened the door to something much darker. They were no longer just on a rescue mission. They were about to face an enemy the galaxy wasn't prepared for. The sound of something large moving in the distance echoed through the colony, sending chills down their spines. And then, the first scream tore through the air. The team's footsteps echoed through the eerie silence of the abandoned colony as they cautiously moved forward, each step heavier than the last. The walls of the outpost, once gleaming with the bright promise of civilization, now looked worn and decayed, as if time itself had abandoned this place. The air was thick with the scent of old metal, dust, and something faintly metallic that sent an uncomfortable chill down their spines. Captain Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but there was nothing around them except the emptiness and the faint hum of energy coming from deep within the colony's core. The crew moved deeper into the facility, their boots tapping against the floor with each measured step. The faint rumbling sound they had heard earlier seemed to be getting louder, though no one could tell exactly where it was coming from. It was as if the entire planet itself was alive, shifting and groaning beneath their feet. There was no sign of any human presence, no bodies, no abandoned belongings, no traces of life at all. Yet the strange energy field surrounding the building grew stronger as they approached the central hub. Suddenly, the lights flickered to life with a violent burst, casting sharp shadows across the empty halls. The room ahead of them had an ancient technological feel to it, like something out of a forgotten age. Hawk motioned for the crew to halt, scanning the surroundings. His instincts told him something wasn't right, but he couldn't put his finger on it. His eyes scanned every corner of the room, every blinking terminal, every strange marking on the walls. They were not the usual symbols of the colony, but something older, something alien. A low, mechanical growl reverberated through the air, and the ground beneath them trembled. Captain Hawk stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. It was the sound of something large, something alive, and it was coming closer. The crew looked around in confusion, but there was nowhere to hide. The noise grew louder still, and a bright light flickered in the distance, casting strange, unnatural shapes on the walls. It was then that they saw it, the first signs of movement. A shadow emerged from the doorway at the far end of the room. It was massive, too large to be any human or animal. The creature was humanoid in shape but distorted. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, its skin an ashen gray, and its eyes glowing with a pale, sickly light. As it moved, the air seemed to grow colder, heavier, like the very presence of the creature bent the laws of nature around it. The crew froze, every instinct screaming at them to run, but they were trapped in this ancient, decaying structure. The creature stopped in front of them, its eyes boring into each of them one by one, as if it could see into their very souls. Then it spoke, not with words, but through a chilling, guttural sound that reverberated through their bones. "We are the end." Before anyone could react, the creature lunged, its speed inhuman. The crew barely had time to fire their weapons before the creature reached them. Captain Hawk barely managed to pull the trigger, but the creature seemed unfazed, its body shifting to absorb the shots. Its skin was like metal, impervious to their weapons. Panic spread through the crew as the creature advanced, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of jagged obsidian teeth. Then, as suddenly as it had attacked, the creature froze, its glowing eyes shifting to a dark shade of red. The air around them grew dense, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. A hum, deep and unsettling, filled the space, vibrating through their bodies. Hawk felt a surge of coldness wash over him, as if time itself had slowed. The lights flickered again, and before their very eyes, the creature began to shift, its form distorting, its limbs elongating, twisting into something even more grotesque. It was no longer just a creature. It was a being of pure chaos, a force that could bend space and time. The crew's weapons were useless against it, and the realization hit them like a wave. This was no ordinary alien. This was something far older, far more dangerous, an entity that existed outside the boundaries of their understanding. And that was when it spoke again, this time in a voice that reverberated in their minds, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You are not alone. You have called us, And now, we take what is ours. The ground beneath them trembled once more, and the creature's form continued to warp and shift, becoming something entirely new. The reality around them seemed to fold in on itself, as if the laws of physics no longer applied. Time itself was bending. The crew's attempts to fight back were futile. They couldn't even land a single shot before the very ground seemed to shift beneath their feet. Panic gripped them, but there was no escape. The last thing Hawk saw before everything went black was the creature's eyes, glowing brighter and brighter as it loomed above him, its body stretching out like a living nightmare. The universe had just taken a turn for the worse. What had come back to answer the distress signal was far more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. And now, they were caught in its grasp, victims of something far older and more powerful than they could ever hope to understand. The galaxy's last hope had already been consumed. The crew's senses were assaulted by the overwhelming presence of the creature. As their minds struggled to grasp the sheer scale of what they were facing, the very environment around them seemed to warp and change. Hawk's vision blurred for a moment, but as it cleared, the air felt thicker, almost suffocating. A crushing weight pressed down on their chests, as though the laws of gravity themselves were being twisted. The alien's form had fully shifted now, no longer humanoid, but something more complex, more terrifying. Its body flickered between dimensions, parts of it existing in multiple places at once. One moment it seemed to stretch across the walls. The next it was right in front of them, its glowing red eyes burning through the darkness. The creature's mouth opened wider than physically possible, revealing rows of teeth that looked like they could tear through time itself. "Don't look away." Hawk heard his own voice, strained and desperate, through the chaos in his mind. "Keep your eyes on it. We can't let it get in our heads." The team nodded, each member now terrified, but holding on to their training. They had to keep their focus. But their weapons were useless. Every shot fired into the creature seemed to dissipate before it could even touch it. The energy pulses they launched were absorbed into the creature's dark form like nothing more than whispers in the wind. It was as if the being was part of the very fabric of the universe itself, a dark force that could not be touched by the tools of man. "Retreat," Hawk barked, his voice hoarse. "Fall back to the ship now." The crew began to move, but as they turned, the floor beneath them trembled once more. The structure groaned like it was alive, shifting and changing to trap them in place. The walls began to pulse, and the air seemed to hum with a low, vibrating frequency. The creature's form contorted again, distorting the space around them. Its eyes locked onto them. And that was when it happened. Time itself seemed to stop. The crew staggered, frozen in place, as if they were caught in some sort of stasis. The creature was everywhere now, not just physically present, but in their minds. Hawk felt a cold, invasive presence, something crawling into his brain, whispering directly into his thoughts. He tried to block it out, but the voice was persistent, cruel, and mocking. "You are nothing, just a speck in time. You called, and now you will serve. The end is already written." Hawk gritted his teeth, trying to push back the intrusive thoughts, but they were relentless. His crew members looked just as affected. Some of them were visibly shaking, their eyes wide with fear as they clutched their heads, struggling against the mind-altering power of the entity. Then, the voice was gone. The world snapped back into motion, but everything had changed. The walls were no longer the same. They now seemed to stretch endlessly, a twisted maze that distorted reality. The floor beneath their feet felt like it was shifting with every step. The ship was still several miles away, but there was no way they could make it back without being caught. The creature's presence was overwhelming, and with every passing second, it seemed to grow stronger. The team tried to move again, but it was futile. No one could focus. They couldn't think straight. Hawk felt an overwhelming sense of doom wash over him, a complete loss of control. The creature's power was too much. They had unleashed something far beyond their comprehension, and it was too late to stop it. Then something even more terrifying happened. As the creature loomed in front of them, its form twisted once more, and the surroundings seemed to change again. This time, however, it wasn't the walls or the floor that moved. It was the very nature of reality itself. Time stretched, bent, and folded like a piece of paper being crumpled and unfurled again. Hawk's eyes widened in horror as he realized the truth. The creature wasn't just manipulating the physical world. It was manipulating time. The monster was bending reality to its will. The crew found themselves flashing in and out of moments. 1 second, they were standing in the wreckage of the colony, and the next, they were back on the Starfire, the distant hum of the engines vibrating beneath their feet. In an instant, they were standing in the same hall again, but this time everything felt different. The walls were decayed further, the air thicker with the suffocating silence. "What is this?" Sasha, the communications officer, whispered, her voice trembling. She looked down at her hands, as if she wasn't sure if they were even real anymore. This isn't real. We're trapped." Lieutenant Mason, the ship's tactical officer, shouted, his voice cracking. "It's messing with time. We've become part of its game." Hawk's heart raced. The creature wasn't just here in the physical world. It was changing them, reshaping their existence. They weren't just fighting for survival now. They were fighting for their very reality. The longer they stayed, the more the lines between time and space would blur, until they were lost in a loop they could never escape. The creature's voice, once again, echoed in their minds, sending waves of cold dread through their bodies. "You call for help, but only I can answer. This galaxy is mine. It always was." Panic gripped the crew, and they fought to break free from the mental and physical grip the entity had on them. Every second felt like an eternity. Hawk, feeling the weight of his responsibility, knew they had only one chance left. But what could they possibly do? Their weapons were useless, and their minds were under siege. With the creature's power over time growing stronger, the captain made a final decision. "Back to the Starfire," Hawk shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "We can't fight it here. We need to get to the ship. It's our only chance to break free." But even as he turned to move, the world shifted once again. This time, it wasn't just the walls. They were being pulled in every direction, time and space warping into a nightmare. The crew was being scattered, torn apart by the creature's will. As everything around them disintegrated, one thing became clear. The galaxy's last hope had already become its greatest nightmare. What had come back was more than a threat. It was the end. And no one, not even the might of the universe's military, could stop it. And the worst part, they hadn't even begun to understand the true extent of the creature's power. As the crew scrambled to regain control, the universe around them continued to collapse in on itself. Time, once a solid constant, now bent and twisted in unimaginable ways. One moment, the team was in the crumbling corridors of the abandoned colony, their feet slipping on the decaying metal floors. The next moment, they were standing on the Starfire, the ship's cold steel deck offering them no comfort. But even here, there was no safe haven. Hawk's head spun. His eyes darted around, but nothing seemed real anymore. The ship, which had once been their refuge, now felt like a cage, an inescapable tomb, its corridors stretching endlessly, as though they were trapped inside a living, breathing organism. "Captain," Lieutenant Mason's voice trembled through the comms. "The ship's systems are going haywire. I can't stop it. It's as if the creature is inside the ship. It's everywhere." Hawk gripped the control panel in front of him, trying to steady himself. His hand trembled, sweat pouring down his brow. "We can't let it win. It's not over yet. Get the crew together. We need to think." Think. He was desperate for a solution, but his mind was clouded. The creature had already done too much. Every system was compromised, every escape route blocked. The ship itself felt like it was being controlled from somewhere far beyond, as if it were just another extension of the creature's terrifying influence. The air around them grew colder. They couldn't even breathe properly. As the ship continued to shift, the Starfire seemed to lose its shape, the metal walls warping and the lights flickering, as if responding to the creature's will. Hawk could feel it. The creature was toying with them, making them suffer before it finally took them. But then, something unexpected happened. The ground beneath them stopped shaking. The oppressive force that had crushed their minds seemed to recede, and the temperature stabilized. For a fleeting moment, they thought they might have won. Perhaps the creature had grown tired of tormenting them. But as they exhaled in relief, a deep rumble filled the Starfire, and a terrifying voice echoed through their minds, louder than ever. "You cannot escape. I am the beginning and the end. I have seen all your pasts, your futures, and everything in between. You are not special. You are not different. You are just another blip in the timeline, a fleeting moment before I erase it all." It was then that the crew understood. The creature was not only manipulating their physical surroundings, but their very existence. It knew their thoughts. It had seen their histories, their secrets, their futures. It had already rewritten everything. "We need to fight back," shouted Sasha, the communications officer, her voice rising with panic. "We need to break its hold. There's got to be something we can do." "Fight back," Hawk repeated, his voice hollow. "What are we supposed to fight with? We've got nothing left." His thoughts raced, but every option seemed impossible. The creature was everywhere. It was time itself. It was the universe's end, and they were caught in its grasp. Suddenly, as though sensing their desperation, the creature's presence surged, overwhelming them once more. The ship's systems exploded in a series of violent sparks. The crew was thrown to the ground as a massive shockwave reverberated through the ship. It was as if the very fabric of space had been torn open. In that moment, Hawk felt a wave of dread unlike anything he had ever experienced. His vision flickered, and he found himself standing in the ruins of the colony again, surrounded by death and destruction. But this time, something was different. The colony's walls were no longer just decaying. They were alive, pulsing with an energy that seemed to pulse from the creature's core. "You called me. You should have never called," the voice echoed again. "This is my domain now. This is my reality." Hawk's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, trying to piece together what was happening. It wasn't just the colony that had changed. The Starfire was here now too, but it was twisted, warped beyond recognition. The walls of the ship had melded with the ruined colony, becoming part of the living nightmare they were trapped inside. The lines between their ship, the colony, and the creature's domain had blurred beyond recognition. Sasha was the first to speak. "Captain, the distress signal. It wasn't meant to call for help. It was a beacon. It brought this thing here." Her voice cracked with realization. "The creature, it's not from our universe. It's something else. Something ancient. And now we're part of its world." Hawk swallowed hard, the cold truth sinking in. The distress signal had not been a plea for help. It had been a trap, a beacon that had brought something far worse than they could have imagined. They had called something that had existed long before humanity, something that had no regard for their reality or their lives. The creature had been waiting. It had been watching. And now, with the galaxy's last hope trapped in its twisted dimension, it was ready to begin its reign of terror. But as the crew stood on the precipice of their own annihilation, Hawk's eyes locked onto the central control terminal. Something stirred within him. There was still a flicker of hope. There had to be. The creature may have been omnipotent, controlling time and space itself, but there was something it hadn't counted on. The crew was not alone in their suffering. The Starfire was a ship of warriors, a ship of minds that would not go quietly into the dark. And though the galaxy was crumbling around them, Hawk was not ready to surrender. "Let's find a way to fight back," he said, his voice filled with defiance. "We're not dead yet. We'll make it to the end together." But as he looked around, the reality of their situation crashed down on him. The creature was more than a foe. It was a force that could not be understood, let alone defeated. But even then, he knew something had to be done. They had to find a way to stop it, or everything they knew and loved would be erased from existence. And there was no time left. The final act of their struggle had already begun. The Starfire was no longer a ship of hope. It had become a vessel of fear. As the crew huddled in the shattered remains of their last sanctuary, they could feel the creature's presence seeping into every corner of their minds, twisting their thoughts. It was everywhere, its tendrils stretching through their very existence, bending reality to its will. Hawk's hand gripped the cold metal of the command chair, his knuckles white with the pressure. He had never felt so helpless. The creature wasn't just in the ship, it was in time itself. The lines between what was real and what was imagined had blurred completely. Every flicker of light, every hum of the engines, every breath they took felt out of place, as though the fabric of reality had been shredded and was slowly being rewoven into something darker. I can't hold it together," Sasha whispered, her voice trembling with terror. She clutched her head, as if trying to block out the invasive whispers of the entity. "It's too much. It's breaking me." Hawk looked around at his team, each one of them struggling to stay grounded, their sanity fraying at the edges. The creature had already begun to weave itself into their minds, turning their deepest fears into nightmares. Every thought, every memory felt tainted by its presence, and yet they had to press on. There was no retreat. There was no surrender. "We can still win," Hawk said through clenched teeth, though his own words barely convinced him. He stood up, his resolve hardening like steel. "We don't give up. Not now. Not ever." Mason, who had been silent for far too long, finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "But we can't fight it. We've tried everything. The weapons don't work. The systems are destroyed. We're nothing to it. It knows everything. It controls everything." Hawk turned toward Mason, his gaze steady. "It might think it knows everything, but it doesn't understand us. It doesn't understand what we're capable of when we fight together." He clenched his fist. "We have one last chance, one last shot at stopping it." The crew's collective gaze turned to him, some filled with desperation, others with doubt. But the captain's words sparked something within them, a spark of defiance. If they were going to die, it would be on their terms. They had to try. "How do we stop it, Captain?" asked Dr. Eleanor Reed, the ship's science officer. She had always been the voice of reason, the calm amidst the chaos. But even she could feel the creature's power creeping into her mind, draining her will to think. "We use its power against it," Hawk said. The plan wasn't fully formed, but it was the only idea he had left. The creature controls time. It bends reality, warps it. But there must be a limit to its power. Time isn't infinite, not even for it. It's manipulating everything, but that manipulation must have a center, a point of control. If we can find it, if we can break its hold on time, then maybe we can break its power. The crew exchanged glances, their minds working frantically as they tried to comprehend what Hawk was proposing. They were already deep within the creature's domain, inside the very fabric of its existence. But there had to be a way to exploit its weakness, to turn the tide. "We'll need to access the central nexus of the ship," Dr. Reed said. "The heart of the Starfire systems. If we can inject a temporal disruptor into its core, we might be able to sever the creature's link to reality." "All right," Hawk said, his voice now filled with a renewed sense of purpose. "Let's move. Everyone, to the engine room. We need to get that disruptor into the heart of the ship. Once it's done, we'll have a chance to bring this thing down." The crew moved quickly, navigating through the twisted, ever-changing corridors of the Starfire. The very air seemed to fight against them, thick with the oppressive force of the creature's power. But they pushed forward. They had no choice. If they didn't act now, everything they knew, everything they loved, would be erased. The crew reached the heart of the ship, the central core where all the ship's systems converge. The once pristine room was now a chaotic mess of glowing circuitry and shattered panels. Time itself seemed to warp and twist around them, the world folding and unfolding in disorienting ways. They could feel the creature's presence closing in, the walls vibrating as though it was watching them, waiting for them to make their move. "Ready?" Hawk asked, turning to his team. His voice was steady, but deep down, he knew the odds were stacked against them. They were playing against an enemy that had already demonstrated its control over time, an enemy that had seen the future, and yet they were still here, still fighting. "Let's do it," Mason replied, his voice grim but resolute. Dr. Reed began to work quickly, her hands flying over the controls as she prepared the temporal disruptor. It was a risky plan. If it didn't work, the Starfire would be lost forever. And if it did work, well, there was no telling what would happen. The creature was too powerful, too ancient. It was beyond anything they had ever encountered. But there was no going back now. The moment Dr. Reed activated the disruptor, the ship's systems screamed in protest. The very walls shook, and the air grew thick with the energy of the creature's presence. The ship seemed to implode on itself, reality warping as the temporal pulse shot through the core. For a brief moment, everything stopped. The creature's hold on time faltered, its presence fading, just for a second. The crew stood motionless, their hearts racing, their minds full of dread. And then the creature's roar filled the air, louder than ever, as the walls of the Starfire trembled. Time itself snapped back into place with a violent force, throwing them all to the ground. The creature wasn't finished. It wasn't gone. But now it was weak. The disruption had broken its control, if only for a moment. And that moment was enough. "We have a chance," Hawk said, pushing himself to his feet, his voice filled with renewed strength. "We finish this now, before it recovers." The crew moved with a new sense of urgency, knowing they had one final chance. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time since the creature arrived, they had a fighting chance, and they would make it count. The final confrontation had begun.